Today, we're talking about what happens when the things we carry become so normal that we stop noticing their weight. This is a space for honest conversations about leadership, healing, identity, service, and what happens when strength and humanity exist together. Because carrying it all quietly comes at a cost. When people think about law enforcement, they often think about what officers see: the shootings, the crashes, the overdoses, the violence, the crisis, the moments when lives change in an instant. The moments people imagine stay with you forever, and they're not wrong. Those things leave a mark. But over the years, I've learned that some of the heaviest things officers carry are the things no one else sees. The memories that follow us home, the conversations we can't forget, the faces that stay with us years later, the questions that linger long after the call is over, the guilt of wondering if we could have done more, the grief we absorb but rarely acknowledge, the stories we carry that were never ours to begin with, the hypervigilance that lingers long after the shift ends, the constant awareness that danger can appear without warning, the difficulty of relaxing when your body has learned to stay prepared, the moments that replay in the middle of the night, and sometimes the parts of ourselves we slowly give away in order to keep showing up for everyone else. When I first became a police officer, I believed I was prepared. I had grown up in Northeast Portland. I had experienced loss. I had seen violence. I had learned how to be tough long before I ever wore a uniform. Growing up, strength wasn't something people talked about. It was something you demonstrated. You kept going. You handled what was in front of you. You learned to adapt. You learned to survive. Looking back, I realized many of the skills that helped me succeed as a police officer were skills I had developed long before I ever entered the profession. Staying alert, reading people, preparing for what might happen next, learning how to adapt when circumstances changed, learning how to keep moving when life felt heavy, learning how to carry difficult things without letting the world see how heavy they were. Those skills served me well. They helped me navigate uncertainty. They helped me stay composed under pressure. They helped me show up when people needed me. No one ever told me not to talk about what I was carrying. The message was more subtle than that. You handle it, you keep moving, you don't make it other people's problem. Over time, silence becomes less like a choice and more like a habit. Eventually, you stop sharing because you stop noticing you're carrying anything at all. But what I didn't understand at the time was that the skills that help us survive aren't always the same skills that help us heal. Survival teaches us how to endure. Healing asks us to do something different, but there is a difference between witnessing hardship and carrying responsibility for what happens when hardship shows up. Every call asks something of you. Every victim asks something of you. Every grieving parent asks something of you. One thing people don't always understand about this work is how often you walk into someone's worst day. You arrive after the phone call, after the diagnosis, after the loss, after the violence. You meet people in moments they will remember forever. And while they may never remember your name, there's a good chance you'll remember theirs. Years later, I don't remember every report I wrote. I don't remember every case number. I don't remember every address. But I remember faces. I remember conversations. I remember sitting across from people whose lives had been changed in an instant. I remember the look in a parent's eyes, the fear in a child's voice, the exhaustion of people doing the best they could with what they had. That's the thing about this work. The paperwork gets completed, the report gets filed, the call gets cleared, but people aren't paperwork, and some of them stay with you long after the shift is over. I remember the young people who were carrying far more than any child should have to carry. I remember sitting across from a young person who had already learned not to trust adults. They had experienced things no child should have to experience. As we talked, I realized they weren't surprised by the trauma. They were surprised anyone cared enough to ask. There were days when I spent hours working with young people who had experienced abuse, neglect, violence, or instability. Then I'd come home and see Kenzie. I'd watch her doing homework, laughing, complaining about something that seemed important in the way only teenagers can. And sometimes I'd find myself overwhelmed with gratitude, not because our life was perfect, but because she was safe, because she was loved, because she had opportunities that so many of the young people I worked with deserved too. Those moments reminded me how thin the line can be between very different outcomes. And they reminded me that some of the stories I encountered during the day didn't stay at work when I went home. There were times I found myself thinking about how different life can look, depending on who shows up for you. Not because one child is more deserving than another, but because some children have support systems and opportunities that others never receive. Working with young people taught me that trauma is often less about a single event and more about what happens when people stop believing anyone is coming to help. That's something I carried with me long after those conversations ended. And the truth is, most officers never talk about where all of those pieces go. We just keep moving, call to call, shift to shift, year to year, rarely stopping long enough to ask ourselves what all of those experiences are costing us, rarely talking about the things that stay with us, rarely unpacking the weight we've been carrying, because the next call comes in. The next person needs help. The next crisis demands our attention. And before we know it, months have passed, then years, and what once felt heavy begins to feel normal. That's the part that concerns me most. Not that we carry difficult things, but that we become so accustomed to carrying them that we stop noticing their weight, accumulating experiences without ever really unpacking them. That's the culture. You handle it, you push through it. You show up tomorrow. I was good at that. Maybe too good. There were times when people asked how I was doing, and I answered automatically, I'm fine. And I believed it. Not because I was actually okay, but because I had become so accustomed to functioning that I stopped measuring my well being any other way. Was I showing up? Was I getting the work done? Was I handling my responsibilities? Then I must be okay. Looking back, I can see how much I had normalized. Because eventually I stopped asking whether I was okay. I only asked whether I was functioning. And those are not the same thing. There were calls I couldn't stop thinking about. I'd leave work, get in my car, start driving home, and somewhere along the drive, I'd realize I was replaying the entire interaction. Did I miss something? Could I have done more? Is that family going to be okay? The shift was over, but the call wasn't. Looking back, I realized I wasn't carrying one difficult experience. I was carrying hundreds. There was a time in my career when I realized stress and trauma do not automatically leave when your shift ends. Trauma doesn't just live in our memories. It lives in our nervous systems. It lives in our muscles. It lives in our reactions. It lives in the parts of us that stay alert long after the danger has passed. I could leave work, but work wasn't always leaving me, and yet I kept going. Because that's what officers do. That's what high achievers do. That's what people who have built their identity around strength often do. We keep moving. We keep producing. We keep performing. We keep carrying. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. As long as I was showing up, as long as I was getting the job done, as long as I was handling my responsibilities, I assumed I was okay. But eventually, the gap between functioning and healing became too difficult to ignore. That's what led me to therapy. I remember sitting in my car after a shift, realizing I was exhausted, but I couldn't tell you from what. Nothing catastrophic had happened. I was functioning. I was showing up. I was doing everything I was supposed to do. And yet something felt heavy. Looking back, I think that was the first time I realized functioning and healing weren't the same thing. Therapy didn't magically make the weight disappear. It simply helped me understand I didn't have to carry it alone. It gave me language for things I had normalized: hypervigilance, compassion fatigue, trauma exposure, emotional suppression. I remember sitting in therapy describing behaviors I thought were completely normal: constantly scanning rooms, difficulty relaxing, always anticipating what could go wrong, being uncomfortable when things felt too calm. I wasn't telling these stories because I thought something was wrong. I was describing what I thought was responsible, prepared, professional. And for the first time, someone helped me understand that surviving something and healing from it are not the same thing. That realization changed the way I viewed my career, my stress, and ultimately myself. What surprised me most wasn't learning that I was affected. What surprised me was realizing how many other people were carrying the exact same things: teachers, nurses, firefighters, dispatchers, military personnel, social workers, parents caring for children with significant needs. The details may be different, but the pattern is often the same. We spend so much time caring for others that we stop paying attention to ourselves. We become experts at showing up, experts at solving problems, experts at carrying responsibility. And somewhere along the way, we convince ourselves that our own needs can wait, that our exhaustion can wait, that our grief can wait, that our healing can wait, until one day we realize we've been extending compassion to everyone except ourselves. And learning to extend that same compassion inward can be one of the hardest parts of healing. That's when I began to understand that this wasn't just a law enforcement issue. It was a human issue, a leadership issue, a service issue. a reality shared by people in helping professions everywhere. We become fluent in everybody else's pain while losing touch with our own. And eventually that comes with a cost. For me, part of that cost was realizing how often I stayed emotionally armored. The silence didn't just show up at work, it showed up in my relationships, it showed up in friendships, it showed up in the moments when people asked how I was doing, and I answered automatically. Not because I wanted to be dishonest, but because I genuinely didn't know how to explain what I was carrying. After a while, silence becomes less about hiding and more about forgetting that you're allowed to need support too. Not just at work, at home, in relationships, in friendships, in everyday life. For a long time, I didn't realize how much of that armor followed me into my personal life. I was comfortable being the person others depended on, comfortable helping, comfortable carrying, but being needed and being known are not the same thing. There were times when I could support everyone around me while struggling to let anyone support me. Self reliance had become second nature. Vulnerability felt much harder. Asking for help felt uncomfortable. Receiving support felt unfamiliar. Somewhere along the way, I had learned that being capable was safer than being vulnerable. Looking back, I don't think the greatest risk was carrying too much. The greatest risk was believing I was supposed to carry it alone. That's a lesson I've come to appreciate not just as a police officer, but as a leader. For many of us, leadership becomes another place where we hide our humanity. We convince ourselves that being strong means being unaffected, that being dependable means never struggling, that being resilient means caring more than everyone else. But leadership isn't about pretending the weight doesn't exist. Leadership is having the self awareness to recognize when the weight is affecting you. Leadership is understanding that what we don't address eventually shows up somewhere else in our decision making, in our relationships, in our patience, in the way we show up for the people who depend on us. And that's why taking care of ourselves isn't selfish. It's part of our responsibility because people deserve leaders who are present, connected, and healthy enough to serve well. You spend enough years preparing for worst case scenarios, and eventually your nervous system forgets how to rest. You become excellent at survival, but survival and living are not the same thing. Healing required me to understand that the tools that made me effective were not always the tools that made me whole. Hypervigilance made me a good officer. It did not make me peaceful. Emotional control made me professional. It did not always make me connected. Self reliance made me capable. It did not always make me healthy. Some of the things that helped me succeed professionally were limiting me personally. That was difficult to admit, because those were also the very things people praised me for. That was a difficult truth to accept, because when something has helped you survive, it's hard to imagine putting it down. But healing often asks us to examine the very things we've been praised for: the armor, the toughness, the self sacrifice, the endless endurance, not because those things are bad, but because they were never meant to be permanent. Armor protects us in battle. It becomes exhausting when we wear it everywhere. Today, I still believe deeply in service. I still believe in leadership. I still believe in showing up for people. I still believe in the value and importance of public safety. But I also believe that the people doing the work deserve permission to be human, permission to struggle, permission to be affected by what they've seen, permission to admit when they're tired, permission to ask for help, permission to rest, permission to heal. Permission to be something other than strong all the time, because the goal isn't to become immune to hardship. The goal isn't to carry more than everyone else. The goal isn't to prove how much we can endure. The goal is to serve without losing ourselves in the process, to lead without abandoning our humanity, to care for others without forgetting that we deserve care too. If you're someone who spends your life caring for others, I want you to consider a question. What are you carrying that no one knows about? What grief have you convinced yourself you're supposed to carry alone? What stress have you normalized? What exhaustion have you ignored? What part of yourself have you been asking to wait while everyone else gets your attention? And what would happen if you stopped pretending it wasn't heavy? What would happen if you acknowledged the weight, if you asked for support, if you extended yourself the same compassion you so freely offer everyone else? Because strength isn't about carrying everything alone. For years, the silence stayed. It followed me from childhood into adulthood, from life into policing, from work into relationships, from survival into leadership. And healing began when I finally stopped treating that silence like strength And healing doesn't begin when the weight disappears. It begins when we're finally honest about what we've been carrying. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Compassion Over Silence. Until next time, remember, you were never meant to carry everything alone. This is Compassion Over Silence, leadership, humanity, honest conversations.